Oh, hello, my name is Sharon Roberson. I'm president and CEO of the YWCA Nashville and Middle Tennessee. Thank you so much for joining the YWCA for a Stand Against Racism Lunch and Learn on the topic of today, racism in sports. We think it is very important to have these really important conversations with our community. So we make sure that we have an open discussion. We always say at the YW, we invite you, we do not indict you. So as we move along in this conversation, should you have a question, you are welcome to put your question into the chat. What we are talking about today is so important because there's a lot of historical knowledge about sports that many people are not aware of. We have a stellar panel today that have both more of an academic approach to this issue, but also who have real life and real world experiences. Over the century, we have seen how historically white institutions, like many in this country, have discriminated against people of color, specifically Black people. For years, Black athletes have tried to use their platforms to advocate for racism and advocate against racism and economic exploitation in the United States. Now more than ever, we need to have these conversations and to look critically at these issues so we make sure that we learn lessons from what has happened in the past. First of all, I'd like to thank the Nissan Foundation for making this webinar possible and PNC Bank for its support. Throughout this conversation, we hope to build community, spark dialogue, build a collective consciousness of legacies of discrimination and oppression, and inspire imagination and creativity to bend that arc toward justice and liberation. A little bit of background. As with many institutions in this country, there's a foundation of segregation in sports. During the 1900s, historically white sports institutions in the US barred Black people from participating in organized sports, both internationally and professionally in this country. So Black people in the United States established their own leagues. Many are not aware that there were baseball leagues and basketball and cricket leagues for Black people. We're going to get more into this. Hopefully some of our panelists will speak to this. We also know the history of the 60s when this country was going through an internal revolution. Many of you know the story of the iconic players such as Muhammad Ali, Bill Russell, Tommy Smith, and John Carlos. If you don't know their names, I invite each of you to research them. They use their platforms to advocate for civil rights against racial discrimination, and they endured a lot and they sacrificed a lot. Many of you are aware of more recently, Colin Kaepernick. He took a knee during the national anthem, and this was very much misunderstood. I had many individuals that were in my circle of friends that did not understand how he, as a quote, privileged athlete, could feel as though he was not privileged as a man in this country, as a Black man in this country. We also know about the WNBA players that were one of the first athletic groups to wear warm-ups that said Black Lives Matter. Why did these players feel as though this was significant to make this statement? Coaches and athletes a lot have had to try to advocate their position, and often they are faced with just shut up and play. Now, many of you know my background as a corporate lawyer, and I've seen corporate executives ask questions on a number of issues having nothing to do with their particular area of expertise. Why is it there's so much backlash when athletes do this? As I said, we have a stellar panel, and I'm so excited about this panel because there are individuals here that can speak to you on these issues and will helpfully enlighten you. I will call them by name and ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, tell us about their work in athletics and how they see gender and/or race at play in sports. I want them to talk too about how athletes are treated and any personal experiences they might have. I'll start with you, Reggie Williams. Please introduce yourself. You're muted, Reggie.
I'm sorry, trying to carry along with
goes
the
with the
protocols.
territory.
No problem. But anyway, good morning and good afternoon to each and every one of you. My name is Reggie Williams. I'm the head baseball coach at Alcorn State University. Actually, I'm a new baseball coach here at Alcorn State University. I've been here since September. I come to Alcorn State after 33 years of professional baseball experience as a Major League Baseball player, an executive at the minor league level, and also a baseball coach in the development department with the Milwaukee Brewers and the Cincinnati Reds, and also vice president of communications and community relations with the Memphis Redbirds, the AAA affiliate of the Memphis Redbirds. So I've been in baseball practically over half of my life, and that's what I bring to the table here at Alcorn State University.
Okay, I'm breaking my own rules.
It's okay.
It's
okay.
It's been a long week. We'll get this together. We'll just
right.
unmute. I won't do the mute, unmute. I'll just unmute and so I have to worry about it. Okay, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Sharon. And Reggie, I'm a Milwaukee Brewers fan, so I'd love to talk to you about your time with the Brewers someday.
Oh yeah, Ryan Braun, absolutely, and Prince Fielder were a big part of that. Absolutely.
Okay, some great ball players. My name's Andrew Marinis. I'm a special projects coordinator at the Vanderbilt Athletic Department, where I work for Candace Lee. And among my responsibilities here is managing the Sports and Society initiative, which looks at issues related to race and gender in sports. I also write books for teenagers and adults on sports and social issues, including racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, and sexism. So these whole intersections of sports and social justice issues are a real interest of mine. So I'm really happy to be invited to be a part of this great panel today, Sharon. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Ms. Robertson,
yes.
If you don't mind, I would be remiss if I did not mention that I was also very fortunate and blessed to be an adjunct professor at the University of Memphis. I saw where Dr. Geekus, she slapped me on my hand to remind me that I was an adjunct professor there during my tenure with the Brewers and with the Reds. So I did that in the off season. So I was an adjunct professor teaching a class called Baseball in America. So I have been a professor at the University of Memphis. So Dr. Geekus, I hope you'll forgive me for that, being with the University of Memphis.
All right. Okay, Eric, now you're with a sport that we don't normally have as a Black executive, so I'm fascinated. Tell me a little bit about what you do.
Well, first, thank you for having me and inviting me to this important discussion. My name is Eric Moses. I'm the president of the Nashville Superspeedway, which is located just outside downtown Nashville. I do have the distinction of being the first track president who is African-American in the sports history. Not something that I think I or anyone else is particularly proud of, given it was 2021 when I was, or 2020 when I was hired. But our sport is one that is making great progress towards appealing to broader audiences and making certain that everyone knows that they are welcome at our track and in our sport. I've been a sports executive for about 15 years now. I was a sports commissioner in Washington, D.C. for 11 years. I was the founding president of an XFL team in Washington, D.C. And I've had the good fortune of talking to and spending some time with Andrew and of being able to call Candace Lee a great friend and someone who has helped my transition here to Nashville over the last 2 years. So happy to join you all.
All right, and Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm Candace Lee. I am the Vice Chancellor for Athletics and University Affairs and Athletics Director at Vanderbilt. And thank you very much for.
Dr. Lee was the first Black.
Oh yeah, I guess I should. You teeing me up, Reggie. So I would say that well, first of all, really happy to be here. Happy to be on this panel with people that I respect tremendously, and glad to be a part of it. I share Eric's sentiment, and I'm the first Black woman to be an athletic director in the SEC, and while many people commented on that and have celebrated that and acknowledged it, it is indeed sad that that's a first in 2020. But particularly when you think about who is competing in college sports, especially the sports that get the most visibility, being football and men's basketball, and many of those participants are Black and brown. So that is unfortunate, but yet I'm really thankful for the opportunity. So happy to be here and be a part.
Okay, let's go back to you, Reggie, and get to some of the harder questions. The questions will be a little bit different than I gave to you, but you can respond because we need to get to the heart of this. Our athletes at the college, even high school, probably middle and lower school level, have felt the need to speak out and advocate for justice. Why do you think these athletes have felt, and why did you as an athlete, why would you feel as though there was a need to speak out against injustice as athletes?
Probably first and foremost, fairness, opportunity. Sometimes in my experience, there have been some young African-American athletes, and perhaps not even African-American, but Latino as well, who were very good athletes, very good ball players. But unfortunately, I can't say for sure, but I know that they were the ones that were released or let go first. And they were very productive. They were good kids, but unfortunately they were cut from the roster when I saw other young people that did not look like me, that were maybe average or less than average, that were kept aboard. And it was kind of mind-boggling. Wow, this guy had speed, he had power, he didn't cause any problems, but yet the organization saw fit to release him. And I tell you, it's nothing like seeing a kid coming into the coach's office to say that we're going to release you, and you see a 27, 28-year-old young man start crying because this is their lifelong dream, and all of a sudden now they're let go for not necessarily anything that they did, but maybe it was just an organizational decision, and sometimes you don't understand that. So standing up and saying, look, we need a chance too, I think that's a good platform to stand on, to say, hey, how about some fairness here? How about an opportunity here for young people that look like myself?
Okay, I'll go to you, Andrew, because you've written extensively about some iconic figures in the Vanderbilt story, Perry Wallace, for instance, who really endured significant racism during his time. Talk a little bit about the way that you have researched or read or experienced the racism that Black athletes have faced at the college level or at the pro level.
Sure. And also to pick up on your last question too, I think in the case of Perry Wallace or other athletes that, they're people too, and are experiencing the same things that anyone else is. You mentioned like friends of yours wondering, how could Colin Kaepernick, a highly paid NFL player, experience racism? Well, of course he can. He's an African-American person in America in 21st century, and so athletes are experiencing the same discrimination that anyone else is. And one difference for athletes compared to the average person is that they tend to have a platform, especially now with social media and with the way that economics of sports have changed for professional athletes, at least. There's a lot of people that listen to them and they have an opportunity to share their opinions with people. Perry Wallace's case, coming along in the 1960s as the only African-American player at Vanderbilt and in the entire SEC, he had a little bit of a platform. There were sports writers there covering the games, but they were primarily older white men who didn't really understand or care to understand what he was going through. And so his platform was a little bit more limited, but I feel that his own existence on the basketball court was a form of protest. When you think about the SEC being formed in the 1930s, and it wasn't until 3 decades later that Perry comes along as the first player, and he's traveling to Alabama a few years after George Wallace is standing in the schoolhouse door. He's traveling to Ole Miss a few years after James Meredith integrates the university. The fact that Perry was standing on these basketball courts where he was told he was not supposed to be, where he thought that he might be shot and killed just for stepping on to the basketball court, incredible courage that he had, but also a platform that he had to make change just through his very existence if he wasn't given that platform in other ways, like you see athletes today.
Okay. Now, Eric, unusual, you are making strides and you are, the first, and the first is always difficult. Trust me on that from my own experience. But tell me a little bit about your sports and the way that you see that you can bring a broader audience to your sport.
It's interesting that that you talk about the difficulties of the first. I tell people often that I don't have a Jackie Robinson story, right? That's not my experience. I have been welcomed into this sport at every level of the sport with open arms, and I think that was important for me to feel like I could be successful in this role. And I have to give credit to NASCAR, but to my colleagues all around the country who have reached out to me, who have made themselves resources. I have friends who are Hall of Fame drivers, who are team presidents, who are in every part of this sport. And those folks, I think, want to help pour into me because I'm curious. I want to know more about the sport so that I can be an ambassador for it, so that folks that look like us will understand that the sport is one that is interesting and fun and different from stick and ball sports. We do have a Jackie Robinson story in our sport, and that gentleman's name is Wendell Scott. And Wendell Scott was the Jackie Robinson of NASCAR. He raced back in the 60s and 70s and 80s and was the first Black driver on what is now the NASCAR Cup Series level, which is our highest level of competition, and was the first one to win a race. And so telling that story, I think, is important to give people context about it, but to also make certain that Black and brown folks know that we aren't new to this sport, as is the case with most things in America. Black and brown people are not new to many things in this country. We have contributed all along to everything in this society. And when given an opportunity, we can excel and certainly can become part of the fabric of those institutions and those sports.
All right, okay. Candace, going back to the original questions, why do you think it's important for athletes to use or leverage their voice as a platform? Or why do you think that they feel that they need to do this?
Well, I mean, I do think that I think it's interesting because I think athletes sometimes they are only thought of in that one context as an athlete. But, we talk to our student athletes all the time about that is one identity of theirs. It's certainly not the only one. But the reality is that identity does carry a lot of weight with a lot of people. And it does, people gravitate towards that because of the visibility, then they can be heard in a different way. So, it's this fine line of trying to make sure that the young people in our care know that they are not only athletes, but because you are an athlete, that does give you the opportunity to leverage, right? Like who you are, what's important to you, what your message is in a greater way. And I do think that balance can be very fine sometimes. I think the other thing is just that, so I think most people know, for part of my story is that I worked a long time for David Williams, who was actually the first Black athletic director in the SEC, and also just a dear friend and mentor of mine. Worked for him for 18 years. And Lord, I lost my train of thought. What was I saying there? Yeah, I don't remember. Gosh,
Yes,
Dave.
well, David does bring an emotional level to all of us, but I will say this. He was a person that brought his whole self to the job and his whole experience as being a Black man in America. And I see that the people that are here, whether or not you actually take a formal stance, if you bring your whole self to these jobs and you are a Black man, especially of David's age, you would have really had to fight a lot of fights.
Oh, yeah.
Part of it.
Yeah, I wish that would ring a bell what I was going to say, but I agree with you.
Well, David used to talk.
Authenticity. I mean, David was unapologetically Black, right? And I think that even his very presence sort of debunks some myths right? So he was this large Black man who had 5 or 6 degrees, who was often the smartest person in the room. And it was always interesting to watch people make assumptions about who he was until they talked to him. Then they realized he was so much more than what they thought. And I think that in many ways, that is our experience sometimes, particularly as people of color in these roles, where there are stereotypes and assumptions that you're having to combat. And you sort of feel like at times maybe you have to be more prepared and you have to be buttoned up a little tighter and you have to check more boxes. I have to say that I feel like what I was going to say was very poignant, but I just forgot. So I am so sorry. That's never happened to me on a panel, but I mean, I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry.
Okay, well, I'm going to say this statement. I want you to see how it feels. I often make the statement because I truly have had this experience that people love my resume but don't love me. And that is very significant in the way that I often view the world, because there have been times where people are thinking, oh, this is great. They read the resume, they read the experience and background. But when I walk into the room or I start giving advice based on that resume, things sort of fall apart. I'm going to go with you, Reggie. You have a stellar resume and background. Now I know you're in, I guess, a very good spot for you, but where have there been times that you have personally had the resume, but they did not like you?
Wow, that would probably take me back a little while, because I have had that experience where I walked in the room and I felt like I was very qualified for the job with my background experience. And first and foremost, I want to say I've been blessed to have that resume. It's not because of me individually, it's because in spite of me, actually. So I have to put that out there. I have to put that out there first and foremost. But when you talk about that opportunity going into, I think it was an interview that I had, I'm trying to remember the company, but it was an oil and gas company in Texas. And it was a marketing job. I have an undergraduate degree in marketing. I've also worked in the public limelight as it relates to being a TV broadcaster, as it relates to an analyst, and having done radio as it relates to being on several talk shows and what have you. But having the opportunity to be a marketing person in that company, I felt like I could have done a lot of things because of my sports background, because of my educational background, and because of my knowledge of that particular industry, because I had done my research. But when I was declined the job opportunity, it was for some lame reason. Well, you know, we really appreciate what you're doing, but we think that you may find other pastures greener in the future. And that's why we decided to move to the next available candidate. And it really hurt my feelings. I felt like I interviewed very well. I answered all of the questions adequately and very candidly, but for whatever reason, they decided not to select me. And the person that they selected, honestly speaking, was not nearly as qualified as I was when I did my research and found out who it was. And that person did not look like me. That person was a little bit younger than me. And so that was a very daunting experience to have not been selected for that position, knowing that I was, in my own opinion, qualified, but yet looked over and not really knowing why.
Okay. All right. Now, Eric, I am thrilled that you are being supported in your role. What do you think is a barrier, because I guess of the maybe the idea of NASCAR for the African American community? What's the barrier to the acceptance?
Well, I think one of the biggest barriers was the presence of the Confederate flag at many of our tracks for a very long time. I mean, dating back, frankly, to the very origins of this sport. That has been eliminated. Thankfully, NASCAR and its leadership has decided that that is no longer acceptable and should not be acceptable at any of our tracks. And so, as I used to say to people, you know, for people of color and conscience, that was a hard stop sign for us. There's no way I'm coming to spend my money or my time with you or your enterprise if there's going to be a symbol of hate there greeting me at the door. I don't care how good the sport is. I don't care what kind of time I would have there. That's not something most of us could get past. So I think that has allowed us to have a more meaningful conversation with diverse audiences about learning more about our sport. And so that's been helpful. I think the other big factor is sports are judged by the participants. So, and Reggie can relate to this, baseball used to be a lot blacker than it is now. There's a problem in baseball at the major league level in particular with there not being as many Black players or superstars at that level. It's the same thing in NASCAR. We have one driver at our highest level, Bubba Wallace, and one Hispanic driver, and Daniel Suarez. And that's it. And no women. Danica Patrick is no longer competing at the highest level in our sport. And so we have two minorities out of, call it 40 teams or so, or 40 drivers. And people look at that and go, well, it's a white sport. There's no one else competing. They don't get the opportunity unless they come to the track to look at our pit crews and see how many African Americans and others are involved on those teams in the pit. How many are executives? How many are selling sponsorships? How many are doing other things throughout our sport in order to contribute to this sport? And so, we've had a program called Drive for Diversity for over 20 years that was intended to bring college athletes into pit crews, but now provides internships throughout the NASCAR ecosystem, as well as supplier diversity and employment, inclusivity with respect to employment. So we are doing things, and we as a sport have to do a better job of telling that story. But I think people just look at the fact that there's just Bubba and Daniel and think, well, there's no Black folks, there's no brown folks in here. I can tell you from experience that the tracks at most places are browner, more female, and younger than most of us would expect.
Okay. Well, it's interesting you say that about the Confederate flag. And I do remember reading some of the news articles around that. Has there been backlash from the fans?
There has, unfortunately, from some. I think it was one of the more poignant things that I've ever seen in sports in June of 20 down at Talladega after that news incident, seeing all of the drivers band behind Bubba and push his car into the grid, and seeing Richard Petty there to comfort him, the guy who was the Michael Jordan of our sport, there to aid him. So that was a beautiful thing. And I think that helped to galvanize our sport to do the right thing. But I will also tell you, since then, at a lot of races, not all, but many, Bubba gets booed when he gets announced. And that's because there is this faulty perception that he was crying wolf, that he somehow made this noose incident into something that it was not. He had nothing to do with it. NASCAR found out about it and went to the FBI, doing what they should have done, which was to react in a way that was protective of their driver and protective of our sport, and being overly cautious to protect him. He had nothing to do with it. He was a victim of circumstance, and then spoke out about Black Lives Matter and things like that, and using that as a window to really give voice to his opinions at that time. And so there has been some backlash. He gets booed by a certain segment of our fan base at many races, and I think that's unfortunate. But I will tell you this also, and Coach Williams will appreciate this: winning cures a lot of that. So if he starts winning more, I think a lot of that will go out the window.
I would tend to agree with you, Eric. You bring out some very good points. And I say that coming out of baseball just recently, there's an issue with baseball right now as it relates to its popularity in the African-American community. Baseball opened the door for sports and athletics as it relates to African-Americans, because before Jackie, there was no one. A lot of kids don't know that Moses Fleetwood Walker was actually the first Black baseball player in the Major League history. But none of them know that. He came up in the late 1800s. He was the first actually Black American to play at the Major League level, but it's overshadowed. Jackie was the first modern day baseball player. But even in the sport now, I believe we have one manager, I believe that's Dave Roberts with the Dodgers. At that level. And if you remember in the World Series a year or so ago, I believe we had one player which was Mookie Betts on the field of all of the players in the at the World Series. So something is missing there. And I know part of it is the fact that they're going and recruiting overseas a lot more heavily. What I would like to see, and they do have some programs now, they have RBI in there, but I would like to see more investment in those kind of academies that they have in Dominican Republic, in some of those other foreign cities. If you go down there to Dominican, you would think you're at a college campus looking at some of these baseball facilities. They don't have that here in America, because I know in my own hometown in Memphis, when you drive around the urban areas of Memphis, the ballparks are littered. They're not manicured very well. They're not taken care of. So what kid wants to play on a field that doesn't look like that? If you go out into Collierville, Cordova, and Germantown, you see very nice ballparks, and kids are looking to get on those fields, but that doesn't happen in the urban areas. So there's a lack of investment in those opportunities for African-American kids.
Yeah, to pick up on that, Reggie, there was a story in the New York Times maybe 2 weeks ago about Ro Coleman, who's a former Vanderbilt baseball player who came up in an academy type of program in Chicago. And he is really, he started a league and he's coaching here, trying to get more African-American kids in Nashville involved in baseball and participating in the types of tournaments that lead to scholarships in college. And it was really nicely done article by Andrea Williams in the New York Times, shining a light on a program here in Nashville. It's trying to get exactly what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
All right. Now, I want to get to one question. I'm going to ask you this question, Dr. Lee, before I go to the heart of everyone says things happen because of money. And I said there's money, but there's also just emotion. But before I get to that, I want to get to follow up on some of this backlash. And all of us are familiar with what Colin Kaepernick did. But that led a lot of student athletes to want to protest themselves because they too felt injustice. And Candace, can you speak to how you handled that on a college campus? You were dealing with young people, and I deal with a lot of young people here at the YW. Their emotion level is very different. Their tolerance for things that are for injustice is at that highest level. They are not going to tolerate these actions. How did you manage? How did you maneuver through that? How did you feel that you gave those athletes their voice, but at the same time, you're not exactly the most liberal institution in this country? I'm putting that out there as a double door. I'm a double, and you're a triple door, I think, but I'm a double door. Love my university, but it is not the most liberal organization.
Yeah, so I would say that this has been challenging, but I think it's been a great opportunity to embrace it as a part of the educational process. So, we believe in freedom of expression, we believe in peaceful protest, but I think beyond that, I want our young people to feel like they can speak their voice and use their platform, but we also want them to be educated on their why. And so even, we've had a number of student athletes over the last, I would say easily 4 or 5 years who do something during the national anthem, right? So they may stay in the locker room, or they may take a knee, or, it sort of runs a gamut. And we told them that by all means, you should feel empowered to do that. And I think, again, as part of helping to develop young people, we wanted them to also understand that everybody will not agree with your stance, right? But that's just life, right? You make a decision and you understand that everybody will not always be in agreement with you. But once you get up off your knee, what is it that you're trying to articulate? Like, what's your stance? And then how do you want to make an impact? And, I think, again, that's, we're using sports as a vehicle to teach, right, and to mold. It is an extension of the classroom and the academic experience. And so that's how we approached it. And it's, as you can imagine, Sharon, you talked about our dear alma mater as not being the most liberal place. And, depending on where you are in your life, there are different reactions to that. But I do think that our responsibility is to make sure that young people feel empowered and have the tools that they need to share what their viewpoint is, regardless of who agrees.
Yes, yes, most definitely. And let's go to the money now. Many of you may be aware, I certainly am, of athletes that were viewed as, you got a full scholarship, you can eat in the cafeteria, etc. But these athletes did not have any money. They often came when I was in school from backgrounds such as there wasn't anyone that could help them out at all at home, but yet the restrictions and requirements of their scholarship as a student athlete was such that they could not even, take a meal out. No one could do anything for them except for their friends. Let's get some of the economic exploitation or racial exploitation of athletes in sport. And I'll start with you, Reggie. You had a long career in sports. Let's talk about the economics of baseball a little bit.
Well, baseball can be an expensive sport and it can be costly. And the reason I say that, a very good bat can cost you anywhere from $250 to $500, depending on the model. A lot of urban kids cannot afford that. A good quality glove, $250 to $300, $400. So that's economically disadvantaging to some kids. Baseball also needs green space. In other words, you need a field, not like basketball. All you need in basketball is a ball. We used to shoot in a milk cart, nail it to a tree. You're on the driveway, you got a ball game. You get 4 or 5 fellas. In baseball, you're going to at least need 18 kids to have a quality baseball game. How are you going to get those kids together? That's difficult. But playing on a nice field that needs to be cut, lined off, and all that, that's expensive. Even in travel ball, that's expensive. I mean, those families are paying a lot of money. So I'm talking anywhere from $1,500 to $3,000 to play travel ball on the team. And a lot of these urban kids, they just can't afford it. They're trying to eat a meal at night. And unfortunately, many of them are in single parent household. Mom is out working 2 jobs, trying to handle 3 kids. So economics is very much a factor in kids being able to be accessed and exposed to baseball. I would love for Major League Baseball teams to bring in HBCU schools and do a tour of a baseball park, not only to see the field, but to see the behind the scenes jobs, because there are other jobs than playing on the field. There's marketing jobs, there are retail jobs, there are camera jobs, there are jobs in the broadcast booth. And see, sometimes if kids aren't exposed to opportunities, how can they know that there is an opportunity there for them to pursue other than just being on the field?
Okay, Eric, you said yes to that, and I know, I have no knowledge of the opportunities other than driving the car in NASCAR. Give us a little bit about that. What are the economics there?
Well, if baseball is an expensive sport to play, motorsports is stupendously more expensive than probably any other stick and ball sport out there. The level of investment that families have to make, even starting at the go-kart level, which is really where young people usually come into our sport as drivers, it can be terribly expensive. And as you move up the developmental ladder, it only gets more and more expensive. Many of the Black drivers and female drivers and others from underrepresented groups, part of their stumbling blocks have been trying to get the sponsorship dollars necessary to support their teams, to pay for the cars and the parts and to get you to the track every week and to pay the enormous amount of money that it costs to put a car that can compete on the track, week in and week out for 38 weekends in a year. So it's a very expensive thing. There is real money to be made if you are successful in our sport, and our NASCAR drivers, especially at the cup level, have become superstars in a lot of ways. But it's a terribly expensive sport to get involved in. And to Reggie's point, though, sports and entertainment, I think, I view them similarly. There are very, very few people who are going to be able to compete and going to be able to turn pro playing or participating or singing. But there's so many more jobs behind the scenes that can keep you close to the action, but not necessarily on the playing field. So as I mentioned earlier, pit crew members, tire changers and jackmen and engineers and mechanics and all kinds of other folks who have to be involved in kind of moving the team and the enterprise, the business forward, as well as the competition part of things. So that's why the Drive for Diversity program is so important to us, because it starts to Reggie's point, if you can't see it, how can you be it, right? If you have no understanding and no reference point for the opportunities that are out there for you, how can you set your sights on achieving those things? And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to provide more reference points, more exposure to young people across the board for all of the things that we do.
Okay,
Sharon, I think this,
okay, go
I was
ahead.
going to say this question about economics and race is interesting because as Reggie and Eric have talked about, there's the cost of entry into these sports, but the other flip side, or the other interesting thing, and Candace can speak more to this, at the college level has been, well, who's paid? You know, who's compensated for playing these sports? And, you know, last week there was kind of a high profile back and forth between Nick Saban and Jimbo Fisher at Texas A&M, and this whole issue of the athletes now in college having an opportunity to be paid, the labor being paid, where in the past, you know, it's strictly been the coaches, the management at the college level, and how this is really changing college sports to a great degree, whether it's through name, image, likeness, where a student athlete can be paid by an outside entity. And Sharon, I think in some of your questions, you were referring to the possibility of the institutions themselves possibly paying athletes at the college level. And so seeing college sports and its relationship to professional sports, I think is something that's been on the minds of people who follow the games for a long time. And it's really in the midst of quite a bit of change right now.
Andrew, is that good or bad? Does this level the playing field and enable some people to really participate fully as even a student athlete? Because that term right there can get you can question that. But as a student athlete, does this enable them to have a more productive and better college experience?
I think that you could argue that either way. If the question is a better college experience, maybe, maybe not. You know, I think that the quality of the education is completely separate, and the ability to actually receive the education completely separate from the ability to make money. You know, I think that's what Perry Wallace always talked about when people would ask him, should college athletes be paid? He said, well, first of all, are they given an opportunity to really go to class? You know, are they encouraged to be students as well as athletes? And so that's a separate question. I mean, if you look at men's basketball and football, like Candace mentioned earlier, that are really the revenue generating sports at the college level, and you look at how much money is being generated through the NCAA tournament, how highly college coaches are paid, and the idea that the athletes themselves are not getting anything, that doesn't seem fair. But I think that is a different question than the quality of their college experience as a student.
Okay.
I'd like to chime in on that as well, because when you talk about athletes being paid, I think that's a good thing. But the one thing about it is it's all about their following, the number of people that are following them. That's who the sponsors are looking for. So it may not be an equal ground. If I got 30,000 followers on my Instagram page, I'm a good guy that somebody wants to sponsor. I may be a quality athlete, but I may not have as many followers. So I may not get that same opportunity to be paid as a college athlete. And I can tell you from my perspective as a head coach, the one thing that I'm trying to be transparent about with my parents is I'm not looking for, when I recruit, I'm not looking for kids that want to come to school to play baseball. I'm looking for kids that want to come to school to graduate and get a degree. And when I tell parents that, and I say that because if baseball doesn't pan out and you're at school just to play baseball, guess what else is going to suffer? My grades. But if I'm at school because I want to get a degree, I may not succeed in baseball. I may go through a slump. But guess what? I'm there to get a degree. So my focus is going to be on my academics, because if you think about it, they are what? Student athletes. That's what's most important, being a student first, an athlete second. So they have to understand that athletics is not guaranteed, but your education will take you a lifetime. And if you understand that, then you can be successful in whatever endeavor you choose to pursue if you come to school with that mindset.
That's cool.
All right, Candace, now you have athletes, this is a new issue. You have now athletes with the ability to get these sponsorships. And, I could see that could be kind of distracting. It didn't take much to distract a college age kid anyway. So then they're trying to get their image out there, trying to get some contract. Talk a little bit about that, the economic sharing the wealth, so to speak, in college sports.
Yeah, I mean, the name, image, and likeness change is just part of, what I'm calling the modernization of college athletics. So, there are some, I do think that there are some things that needed to evolve. Now, I think there should still be, I personally believe there should still be a clear line of demarcation between amateur sports, college sports, and professional sports. And, to some degree, we have to wrap our minds around how we define amateurism. But I couldn't agree more with what Coach Williams said about, those of us who are in the collegiate sports space. Again, we are there to be an extension of the academic experience and to help young people reach their potential in all ways. And sports becomes a vehicle for that. I do think we've gotten our wires crossed to some degree, as we're talking about, whether you're talking about name, image, and likeness or student athletes being employees. This is a social justice conversation. At the root of this is a social justice conversation, because again, we are talking about people who have historically been disenfranchised, who are making up most of the participants. And we have people like me who sit around the table, and I'm one of two that looks like me, but is making decisions for people that look like me. And I just think that sort of the narrative needs to change about how we're supporting young people. When you look at graduation rates, it's really hard to say that kids are coming to school to graduate, like Coach Williams is saying, and that we're putting the resources behind them to do that. I have no issue at all with name, image, and likeness. It's part of, I think, being in America. I think it makes a lot of sense, but I do think that it's important that I think if you're a young person who is not interested in getting a degree, I don't think you should have to go to college. I think that alone, if you are an elite athlete, then you should be able to be a professional when you're actually skilled enough and able to do it. And I think that because there's a little bit of again, we're getting our wires crossed. I just don't think we're all on the same page about motivation. And I think there's a lot of judgment. I think it's okay if you don't want to go to college, but I do think if you go to college, then there should be certain expectations about what that experience will look like and what those resources are that we can provide.
Well, why do you think those rules have changed, for instance, in basketball? Why do you think that these barriers to you being the LeBron James coming out of high school, going straight to the pros, why were those barriers put in place? And anyone can respond to this, because I've wondered myself.
Well, I think it's complex because then it's also depends on each sport, right? And the governing body for each sport determines when, what the entry point is. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, Eric and Reggie, I would sort of invite you to jump in on this in terms of the why, because I have some speculation, but that's definitely not my space. But
yeah, I would say the pessimistic, maybe realistic part of me would say it's about economics. Mm-hmm. And if you look at it, and Candace is so right about trying to separate out the kind of amateurism from professionals. I love college sports. I went to the University of North Carolina, and my favorite thing in the world is North Carolina basketball. I don't want watching Carolina basketball to look like watching an NBA game. I want those products to be distinctive. The way we can get there is for those young men and women who are talented enough to go directly to the pros, that there is a mechanism and a process for them to do that. So then what we will end up with in college are those who are interested in getting an education, both in the classroom and outside, because we all know, I learned more being on a college campus with people my age and with other adults and academics and all as I did in the classroom. but we get more people who play a different style of basketball. Maybe they're not as talented as those who are going to the league, but to Coach Williams' point, they want to be there. They want to be there for the education and the intangibles. And then we can see the distinction between the products. But that requires people in decision-making positions not to think about the money first. And, people think about the money first. They want the LeBron James and the Kobe Bryants to come to a big time university because of what that does for ticket sales and for TV ratings and for all those things that help to make money. And that money, we know how that money gets distributed and who it does not get distributed to, at least currently. And so I think we have to, if we were able to separate those things out, and you're starting to see that. You're starting to see that with the NBA, with the developmental league. You're starting to see that with the overtime group down, I think Candace there in Atlanta, that is providing a path for those athletes that don't want to go to school. They just want to work on their vocation, which is going to be a sport. They want to get paid for it. They want to be able to monetize their name, image, and likeness, just like a very talented musician at Vanderbilt could do. Right. And so we have to start separating those things out. And the way I think we get there is not thinking with our checkbooks and greed, but thinking about the best interest of the academy and the best interest of the young people who are coming through the academy.
I think Eric said it very well. Good job, Eric. You said it extremely well as it relates to the economics that are involved. And what it does come down to is the dollar. And we live in America. It's a capitalist country, and the dollar moves the needle. And that's what the bottom line comes down to.
Okay, I'm going to go back to you, Andrew. What would be a reason, you talk about the Perry Wallace story and a lot of firsts you've studied many of these athletes, what would be a reason why they would hesitate to use their platform? That Perry was up against insurmountable odds. What are some of the other reasons that athletes may choose to feel a certain way, but to not be as vocal in their position?
Well, I mean, at a basic level, I think some athletes feel that it could cost them their livelihood. In Perry's case, when he gave an interview to the Tennessean the day after his last game at Vanderbilt, where he was going to talk about the racism that he endured, he told me that he knew he was writing his ticket out of town, and that if he told the truth, a lot of Vanderbilt community, white Nashville, wasn't going to want to hear it, and that he would be run out of town. And that's, in fact, what happened. Colin Kaepernick, has not been able to sign with the team since he started his protests. One of my books is about Glenn Burke, who is an African-American baseball player who was gay. And when he was run out of the game because of his sexuality, so there are clear and obvious examples of people who have spoken up or just through their existence, about who they are, that were not necessarily popular with management or fans, and it cost them their careers. And so I think when you talk about economics, you have a brief window as a professional athlete to make a lot of money. You might say, well, it's not worth it really to speak out right now. If I choose to, maybe I'll do that after my playing days are over, or I'll let someone else bear the brunt of the blowback that might be coming from a certain segment of the fan base. And then some athletes, there's the story about Michael Jordan, whether it's true or not, he said Republicans buy shoes too, so they might not feel that it's their job. They might not feel comfortable as a spokesperson being out front on a certain issue. And I think that some degree, it's kind of an indictment of our society that we look to athletes to be the ones to have to speak out on everything, because our politicians maybe are letting us down, or other people who are really in these positions of power are letting us down. And so we're forced to turn to people who are great at a sport. They didn't necessarily get to where they are because they have to be a social leader. It's great when they do, but it's not really part of the job description.
All right, and we only have about 5 minutes, but let me go to each one of you. And we were looking at issues involving justice, civil rights, racism in this conversation. If you had a magic wand and you could change one thing about sports in this country to make it better from a racial justice perspective, what would you change? I'll start with you, Candace.
Well, that's a big old question, Sharon. So one thing that I would change, man, I mean, I guess just in a very basic sense, and this applies outside of sports, but I would just, I wish we could see people for who they are and what they bring to the table, and sort of reward opportunities that that people have earned, and do so without worrying about status quo. That seems easy. That seems like a
Okay, Reggie.
I would say resources, leveling the playing ground. When I go around in my sport and I see what is available to urban kids as it relates to the quality of fields, the quality of equipment, the quality of instruction versus what I see in suburbia, that ground is not level. It's not equal. If I equal the playing ground, I think you may get a different outcome, maybe an even better outcome from those who are less equal in terms of resources, quality fields, quality equipment. Those type of things make a difference in terms of the quality of play. So if you've got good equipment, good resources, then maybe you can have better outcomes in terms of performance.
All right, Eric.
So I think, before I answer the magic wand question, I do want to point one thing out. While we have some very big problems in terms of equity and equality, and there still is racism in sports and in our society, sport is unique in its ability historically to be able to provide common ground to people who otherwise would not see things directly. It gives us the opportunity to sit elbow to elbow with our neighbors who we might not otherwise ever speak to in our lives, and be on the same team for an hour or 3 hours or whatever it is, whether we're cheering for our US Olympic team or whether we're cheering on the same driver at the racetrack. And so I don't want us to lose sight of that. And it has done that in the history of this country in ways that oftentimes we forget about. And so that's a really important thing for us to keep in mind. Yes, we have ways to go, and there are things that we can do in the society that will then filter into sports, but sports helps us a great deal to be able to relate to each other as Americans and as human beings. I would say, if I had a magic wand, I keep it really simple. Like, it's the golden rule. If we would just do unto others and treat people the way we want to be treated, a lot of this would go away. We wouldn't be considering, well, did I not get on the team because of the color of my skin? We would know, no, I can't hit a curveball. That's why I didn't get on the team. And that guy, regardless of his color, can. And that's why he's on the team. So I think if we keep it really simple, that would be the way I would use my magic wand.
All right, Andrew.
I guess the only thing I would add is from like an organizational perspective that teams, leagues need to adopt, if this matters to them, anti-racist policy or working for social justice, racial justice, to stick with it and have the stamina to stick with it. I think, after George Floyd, you saw a lot of organizations issue statements and then, with certain promises and commitments to never allow certain things to happen again. And you could probably look back and see like, well, what have they actually done since they issued that statement? And rather than issue a statement for PR purposes at a time of crisis, to stick with the issue for the long haul, because these issues are not going away.
Yes, and thank you. And I'll leave with this message. Thank you so much to this panel. We covered a lot of material, but hopefully people will understand the reason we're doing this is we want to move from just a system of equality to a system of equity. We want to, where you have kids that are have a history, let's say, of not having the economic equality. We want equity to mean that we put those ball fields out there so that they can have the opportunity to play at the highest level. We want to make sure that people are introduced to NASCAR and to the Speedway, because, I grew up with a father that loved cars, everything cars, and used to watch it on television. And I think he never even thought he would even go to see such a live event. But we need to have it so that all people have the same opportunities. And that may require some equity on the part of our society. So Thank you all very much, and thank all of you who participated. And this is our end of our Stand Against Racism Lunch and Learn. Thank you so much, and thank you, panelists.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Sharon.